There we go. And share this. Oh, okay. I Hebrews 13, I don't think most people know about, would think of it as the altar of grace and mercy. And so this title is sort of something, you'll see why I named it this, um but let's talk a little bit about where we've been. Hebrews has been called a tale of two mountains, and really, last chapter was sort of like the culmination of a lot of things and what the book is really all about. And you could kind of simplify the whole thing by calling it the tale of two mountains. One would be one mountain representing the heavenly Jerusalem and what Christ did and the things that he did in fulfillment of the law, whereas Sinai was the on the way to get there. Sinai is the place where God made the covenant with the Israelites while they were in the wilderness, and it was halfway between their deliverance from Egypt on their way to the promised land. Sort of in between those two spots. But what kept them from coming into the promised land or going to the promised land would be their unbelief. And so the story really is about, like, don't let unbelief keep you from the ultimate mountain, which is not Mount Sinai, but the promised land is the mountain that you left behind and are headed towards now. Sinai is your destination, and it's not. And we discussed that it's not necessarily talking about a plot of ground in the Middle East. It's talking about a heavenly Jerusalem because once you think about it, you know, this world we're living in, and for the person of faith, you're strangers walking around on this earth because your citizenship is from somewhere else. So Sinai is at the center, but it's not the end. Um, the Torah is a chiasm. I don't know if you're familiar what a chiasm is. A chiasm is kind of like if you took if you took a sandwich like a hamburger, and you had the meat in between, and then you had the buns on both sides, then you have sort of like a central thing, and you can't like a chiasm in scripture is like you have something that comes before it, then you have the center of the thing, and then you have the rest of it, but the rest of it will reflect and echo what came before that hamburger patty, right? So a chiasm, like another way to describe it is that like you have sort of a peak or a link in the middle, and on both ends of it, on both sides of it, you have a story going outward, going inward towards the middle and going outwards from the middle of that. But the part that are going out from the middle and going to the middle, they have these echoes of those things that go on either end of it. Okay, so the Torah, the first five books of the Bible, is actually a chiasm. In fact, even for the Jews, the entire Jewish Old Testament is designed in a chiasm. I just learned that this last week, and I didn't know that. I didn't really know that, and so I can't describe that, but I can sort of describe the Torah as a chiasm. Leviticus is the third book, so out of the five books, it's right in the middle, and right in the middle of Leviticus, you have the story of Mount Sinai. So Mount Sinai is smack dab in the middle of the Torah. And so the way that it's that the first five books are constructed is that if you look at the journey has been from Eden going into exile eastward, okay, to deliverance from a king of Egypt, to the wilderness, and then to Sinai. Okay, so Sinai's there in the middle. Now, leaving from Sinai, you go back into the wilderness. Okay, so you have wilderness on both sides of Sinai, and then you get a deliverance from the king of Moab. So you have a deliverance story to parallel the deliverance story of the Pharaoh story. And then they come back from exile westwards to the promised land. So you got the promised land sort of on both sides of it. You've got, the deliverance stories on both sides of it, kind of going inward. And then you've got the wilderness stories going on both sides of it. And then Sinai smack dab in the middle there. So Sinai is at the center of the law. And that's important, especially to a law-abiding Jew, because they see, well, Sinai is the where everything happened. It's the smack in the heart of the Torah, and the Torah is called the law. So in the middle of the law, you have the law, right? It makes sense. It's in the middle of it, but it's not the destination, because it's only part way back from the slavery. It's only, and slavery, Egypt and everything becomes a symbol for sin. Like in the New Testament, we even talk about our slavery to sin, that you've been delivered from it, and those sorts of things. It's all language that goes back to the Old Testament and Egypt, right? So it's only halfway back from the to the promised land, which is the inheritance. So Sinai it's crucial, but it's not the destination. So Hebrews has looked at Sinai as sort of the pit stop. It's the pit stop to the ultimate mountain, which is the heavenly Jerusalem, or Mount Zion. Mount Sinai and the Old Covenant, of course they were good, and Jesus affirmed it. And he says, I'm not taking anything away from the law. And it was necessary, but ultimately, these things were the pointers to the real mountain and to the real sacrifice and the real covenant. These things all pointed to Christ and the work of Christ. They were the I don't know, the whole, is something to hold you over. Is it's kind of the snack to hold you over halfway till dinner time, or the placekeeper. So one thing that, to paraphrase sort of what Hebrews has been saying up to this point is, so let's not get stuck or go back to Sinai, because that would be a disaster. Why would you go back to the old covenant when the new covenant is here? Besides that, the new covenant wipes out what the old, it's like the old covenant that was there to point you to Christ. You don't go back from Christ and go back to Mount Sinai. You keep your focus straight on Mount Zion. So we've come to the edge of Mount Zion, and we saw that you've now come to this mountain, just like the Israelites came to the edge of Mount Sinai. The cloud of witnesses are up there on the mountain, and the angels are up there, and our high priest is up there representing us. And he's representing us with his atoning blood before the judge of all, so we can approach the throne of grace and confidence. So let's leave the elementary things behind, and let's move onwards and upwards and join them. And that's sort of been kind of like the thrust of what he's been saying. So here in verse 13, he's kind of winding things down, but I just kind of wanted to give you that sort of like as an oversight of where we've come from in Hebrews. Here in chapter 13, verses 1 through 3, it says, let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. Some have entertained strangers and they didn't know that they were actually angels, right? So this happened with Abraham. It happened with Gideon. It happened with somebody else in the Judges. But remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. So let's look at this word brotherly love here, because on one hand, you have phileo. Okay, phileo means brotherly love. But you have another philo here, right? Which is philoxenius, right? And so that's love. It actually means love for the strange. But and the literal, that's the literal translation. What it means is love for strangers. So if you think of, the one word that we like to throw around in politics nowadays is xenophobia. It's the same word. Right? It's the same root word, xeno, right? It's xenophobia would be like like either the fear of strangers or being anti-stranger, something like that. Um, I'm not getting into the political thing here, but the Vilozania is like show hospitality to strangers. And one of the reason to do that is because the Israelites were strangers in a strange land. That's where they started out from, was Egypt. And you were strangers. Be kind to the strangers that want to join you. And one of the reasons that you're also friendly to strangers is because you you don't know who they are. Okay, so love your fellow Christians. So we'll kind of like, you've got this phileo and phileo, but you've also got philoxenius, love for strangers. And then you have a statement here about also to remember those who are in prison. It's actually talking about other Christians who are in the prison because they are in the body. They're part of you. So one way to summarize these couple verses is love your fellow Christian, but also love the stranger because you don't know who they are. And don't forget your persecuted brothers and sisters. For example, for us, it'd be in Iran and China, because they are part of you. Don't forget those who are in prison. And we have plenty of our brothers and sisters in prison for the cause of Christ right now. So verse 4, it says, let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. The word there is pornos. So marriage is the first. If you think about marriage, is like one of these big deals in all of Scripture, because it's the model in which God describes His relationship with His people. Quite often, I mean, He describes us as sons. I know, but also ultimately, it's the Christ's body is also the bride, and for God, is on one hand it was the adulterous bride, or but yeah, I mean, he did call him his firstborn son, but the relationship and the type of love is often described as the relationship between a man and his wife, right? So marriage, if you think about it, is the result of the first thing that God saw that was not good. God makes creation, he says, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good. But then when he saw man alone, it's the first thing that God says, this is not good. And he puts them in a relationship. So, so it's ultimately the picture of the relationship between God and his covenant people. But then again, adultery and fornication, which he's talking about here, is also what's equated to unfaithfulness to God. So adultery and fornication is again and again the picture that God paints when people who are His start abandoning Him and going after other gods, or just abandoning Him. Keep your life free from the love of money. There's another word there with phila in there, right? Aphilaguros. And be content with what you have, for he said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Aphilaguros means anti-love or no love of money. So aphil, like if you think atheist, right? It's like aphil means like no love for, or having no love for money, guros. So I will never leave you. Now, there were, of course, rich Christians in this community, and there were poor Christians in this community. It wasn't, like an indictment of those who had the money. It was just the point is, don't let money own you. You're not living for that. You're living as a stranger in this world. Don't hold on to your money or live for it, because you can confidently say at that point, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? Man can take your money, and if you're attached to it, you are vulnerable. But if you're not attached to it, well, then what can man do to you, as far as that goes? Verse 7, it says, remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. This is actually a picture of the people the apostles who first reached this group of Hebrews. And maybe a lot of them by this time had passed away, or been killed, or whatever else. So he's talking about these guys as if they aren't there anymore. Uh, So remember your leaders. These were leaders who first brought the gospel to them, and some of them were dead. Just the phrase "remember them," they are dead, but of course they're still alive and in the cloud of witnesses. But remember them, and then consider the outcome of their faith. So the result of their faith, which their faith meant salvation to them, of course, but it also meant salvation to you because they, through faith, reached you. So the outcome of their faith meant their salvation and ours. And then the statement, Jesus is the same, today, yesterday, and forever. Peter, James, John, Paul all lived a long time ago. You read about these Bible heroes, and even in the New Testament, they're all gone. But we imitate them because it's the same Jesus. It's the same Jesus that they serve, and he's alive, and the faith is the same. Do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings. So here's that Zanias again, or the another form of Xenos, right? So now here is the Xenos what that you should avoid. So don't be like, love strangers and consider yourselves strangers in this world. But when it comes to these teachings, treat that as strange and avoid it. So there's a contrast that he's making here. Um, do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings. Now, he's not talking about like bizarre, weird doctrines and all that. Those are there too. I mean, we can take a hint from that. He's actually talking about things that they're very familiar with. These are actually old covenant style teachings. And the problem is that like some people are trying to reincorporate those into the new covenant, and the way that he's treating them is what we call Judaizers, and the teachings of the Judaizers is that he's treating these as strange. It's not in the sense that they've never heard these things before. It's in the sense that you got to treat these as strangers to your faith, and the new covenant that's been put before you. So don't be led away by these diverse and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace. So whatever they're teaching is not based on grace. So it's good to be strengthened by grace, not by foods which have not benefited those devoted to them. So like I said, men elaborated on the Torah. I mean, they went way beyond the Torah, and they made rule upon rule. Some were experts in the technicalities of these ritual food observances. And of course, Judaizers were trying to bring this back into the church, or trying to bring this into the church. Again, these Zanias teachings are not strange in the sense of weird or unknown. They're strange in the sense of being foreign to the new covenant. Verses 10 through 12. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. He's talking about the tent. I mean, those who serve the tent. He's talking about the temple, actually. It's nicknamed the tent because it's still the tabernacle. Like those things are kind of like, you can be nicknames of each other because they serve the same function. But the old covenant system was still in play here. The temple had not been destroyed, and Jerusalem was still standing. So all of this was still going on. Now, here's what was going on is that Christians, those who believed in the new covenant, they were actually being accused of being illegitimate because they didn't have an altar. They didn't have an altar that they could bring their sacrifices to. So here the writer is what he's doing is he's excluding them. He's delegitimizing them in a way because he's saying we have an altar which those who work at the temple don't even have a right to eat of because they don't acknowledge Christ. Those who do not acknowledge Christ cannot partake in this altar and in this sacrifice. Um, verse 11, for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. There were sacrifices that you could eat, but the sacrifice for sin, you took the blood and you brought that in, but the body of the animal that was to be burnt and was to be burnt outside the camp. In other words, outside of the camp, whether and in the case of Jerusalem, it's outside of the city gates. That's you just bring it outside of the community of God because God's people are holy. The unholy is left outside the camp. It's put outside of the city gate, out of religious life, out of civil life. You are outside. You're locked out, right? And so it's kind of like it's a symbolic of the discarding of sin or the filth or the contamination or whatever else that's kind of like that has to go on the outside. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. So in keeping with that symbolism, Jesus was brought outside of the city limits, and he was sacrificed there. So when we're talking about this altar, what are we talking about? We're talking, in my mind, it's talking about the cross. And we have an altar, which is the cross, and that's where we can go to. So Jesus suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Again, the sin offering was not consumed, and the altar was inside the camp. But for us, the body of sacrifice is Jesus's body, and the blood of atonement is his blood, and the altar is outside of the camp. And what's this mean? It's the altar of exiles. The cross is the altar of exiles. So for the Jew who accepted Christ as the sin offering, it meant accepting the sacrifice that was to be burned outside of the camp, outside of the city gate. It's exiled from sacred life and from civil life. And since a Christian has no altar inside the camp, at least not in the old covenant Jewish mind, or it's not, or in the city, to embrace the altar of the cross meant ostracism from the camp or from the city, and it still means that. To add to that, we're his body. And that means that we are a sacrifice counted in our flesh as dead, but we're life to Christ. We're a living sacrifice. And to follow Jesus is to carry your cross going outside the camp. Because we're exiles and strangers. We're xenos on the earth. So that kind of like brings light here to verses 13 through 16. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach that he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek a city that is to come. Through him, let us continuously offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Again, embrace the cross and the altar that's outside of the camp, and in fact, even in embrace the reproach that he endured, because you're carrying your cross too. So here to kind of paraphrase this passage, embrace exile and reproach and keep your eye on the prize. Through the real sacrifice of Jesus, we can legitimately offer sacrifices and worship him, but it's in spirit and in truth. So, and then through a non-love, of money, you can share freely and do good, because you are acknowledging by doing that 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 you are in exile. You're not relying on this, and that you're acknowledging your current exile and your future inheritance. You're living for something else. And so, of course, generosity is a sacrifice that's always pleasing to God. That's why he says, do not neglect to do good and to share with what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. He's saying this all in the face of, the what was expected of them as good Jews, right? Verses 17 through 18. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls. Boy, um that's something, right? I mean, both as like somebody who was a pastor or something, that like for that their task is to watch over your souls. Um and So obey them and submit to them, as they are responsible for your souls, as those who will give an account. They're going to give an account for the way that they handled you. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. It's not your advantage to put your spiritual leaders through all kinds of stuff. um and pray for us, for we are sure that we have a clear conscience, desiring to act honorably in all things. I urge you the more earnestly that you do this, in order that I may be restored to you the sooner. This statement right here, that I may be restored to you sooner, that sounds like Paul or somebody like that, that's saying that they're being held up. Maybe they're in prison. I don't know. But the way that this reads, pray for us, for we are sure that we have a clear conscience. It sounds like that they may have been accused of something that they didn't do, um, because but they've been at this. He's insisting here that they've been acting in clear conscience, desiring to act honorably in all things. So they're being accused and maybe held prisoner for something unjustly. I urge you the more earnestly that you pray for this, that I may be restored to you the sooner. So to me, it sounds like some of them have been put in jail um, you know, unfairly. Now may the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant, not the old covenant, but the eternal covenant, equip you with everything good that you may do his will. This is what grace is, by the way, guys. Grace grace has got two sides of it. Grace, of course, has the side of mercy and forgiveness, but grace is also empowers you and equips you. Um, in particular, it empowers you and equips you to do his will, to do his work. It's not about grace to be successful in all kinds of stuff, including your grades and business endeavors or whatever. God's grace can extend to all those things, but when somebody like Paul again talks about, by he said at one point, grace was given to me to reach the Gentiles. He was equipped by God, by God's grace, with a supernatural ability to communicate the gospel to non-Jewish people, and whatever God calls you to, he's ready to equip you to do. That's what this is about. Equip you with everything good that you may do his will, working in us that which is pleasing to his sight through Jesus Christ, to whom be the glory forever and ever. Amen. And finally, the end here, end of the book, verse 22 through 25. I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation, for I have written you briefly. It took us months to get through this, but yeah, I've written to you briefly. You should know that our brother Timothy has been released. So Timothy had been in prison, with whom I shall see you if he comes. So he's going to join Timothy and come and see this group of people. Greet all your leaders and all the saints. Saints there should it's literally the holy ones. Greet all your leaders and all the holy ones. Those who come from Italy send you greetings. So he's been in contact with some Italians, probably Romans. And grace be with all of you. And that's it for Hebrews. We are done. And Cherie, you came in a bit later, but and Chris, we are going to start Daniel next week.
Daniel, I love
Daniel.
I love Daniel.
Yep. So
We need some Daniel right now.
yeah, I was kind of like I was at first I didn't want to do Daniel because I thought, well, I'm kind of rehashing one of my pet books or something. But like I was going, wait a minute, there's so much connection between Daniel living in exile as a stranger in a foreign land and all that kind of stuff, that I was like, well, it's actually a great segue. These last few weeks are actually a great segue into Daniel. So I've just been feeling Daniel, and I'm like, man, I may as well just do it. So next week we'll do the intro to Daniel, and then we'll probably start on chapter 1 the week after that.
That's going to be good for the times.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
But as you'll see, Daniel's actually good for all the times. But yeah, if you want to, yeah.
A pick me up.
Okay. Yep.
Yep. There's some hope. Pick me up.
Yep. Definitely. I got some coffee here. Well, what do you guys think? Of course, those were like the concluding remarks, and he writer of Hebrews there is just kind of giving you some last exhortations because of everything he's been saying. He's saying it almost reads like a list of instructions, right? So he's going to be like, well, keep marriage holy and be kind to strangers and to each other, and remember those who are being persecuted for the faith and all those kinds of things. Who is the writer of Hebrews? We don't know. Nobody knows for sure. There's a big church tradition that that made it about that thinks Paul wrote it.
Is that because it's Timothy at the end?
There's, my attitude about Hebrews getting into it was like, Paul didn't write this, right? It's written in a different style than his but there's so many points, remember, that we would stop and I go, Paul also says something very similar to this. Remember that? All the time. I'd be like, Paul brings this up when he's writing Philemon. Paul brings this up when he's writing Romans. Paul brings this up when he's writing Corinthians. He says something similar, like, so sometimes I felt like, man, it's somebody like Paul. I mean, or it's somebody who's thinking the same things that Paul and seems, but it would make sense too that they would, even if it's a different writer, that they would share a lot in common because it's somebody who's been steeped in the Old Testament and educated to such a degree that Hebrews assumes so much about the Old Testament. Right?
Maybe it was Luke.
Some people think it was Luke. Yeah.
Because I know he was traveling with Silas too.
Mm-hmm.
Silas, Timothy, all 4 of them.
Right. I think as far as around going back to about 100 AD, all the writings of Paul were put in one place called the writing, the epistles of Paul. They were put in one collection, and it included Hebrews. So there's a tradition going pretty far back that it was Paul. I'm not stuck on that idea, and I'm not stuck on it. So the whole time I've just said the writer.
Did It's a good word.
It's a good word. In fact, and even the Western Church wasn't even familiar with Hebrews until later. You know, the Eastern Church had had Hebrews for a long time, and the Western Church, they were like, well, we don't know who wrote this, but this is something we agree with. And that's kind of like the main thing, you know. It's like there were some books that were floating around, and you know, it's just like you read one of them. A Christian read like a Gnostic book, say like around 300 AD or after Gnosticism started, or what, you know, really took hold. They would read a Gnostic gospel or something like that and go, this isn't what we believe. But something like Hebrews, even though they weren't sure about who wrote it, you know, they read it and go, this is absolutely what we believe. So yeah, it's a great book.
We could ask Paul when we get to heaven.
Hey, Paul, did you write
Yeah.
Hebrew?
How come you didn't introduce yourself like all the other books? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, one guy that I followed, and actually I drew a lot from him as a source was, his name is Stephen DeYoung, and he always says, and Paul says here, Paul, you know, he's completely convinced that it was Paul.
Huh.
He's, you know, he's Eastern Orthodox. Stephen DeYoung is, and he's done some good work on the Divine Council, and I thought he did a good job on Hebrews. I mean, I didn't agree with some stuff, but you know, I thought it. And besides that, his podcast on Hebrews was coming out like always the week before I was going to cover that chapter, so it's kind of handy. You know, I was like, "Oh, cool! I'm going to do Hebrews 8 in 2 weeks," and he just came out with his podcast. I hope he keeps up with it. Other sources that I like Amy Peeler. Of course, I used a lot of the you know, Blue Letter commentaries like Matthew Henry, Fawcett and Brown, and you know, all those traditional Protestant guys, and then and some other people, and I kind of forget their names. You know, a lot of podcasts. So,
It's a lot.
and you kind of put them all together, and then sometimes you're like, well, that makes sense, and other times you're like, I don't know if that makes sense. Oh, I did go through all of what's his name, Michael Heiser's.
Your favorite.
My favorite, but not my favorite for Hebrews.
Yeah.
You know, there are definitely things before Hebrews where I was like, where he was very helpful, but then but as far as his podcast, those weren't my favorite from him, you know, for Hebrews. No, he just did them on his own. And it's funny because for him, when you got to the thing about faithfulness, he took an approach that was like, it has nothing to do with your works, right? It's your faith and your loyalty. Stephen DeYoung was like, faith is faithfulness, and it's about, and it had a lot more to do with works of faith, right? And so I had like kind of like two extreme opposites, not extreme, but you know, like two sides of the coin, you know, like giving the opinion as far as those goes. Amy Peeler is sort of like in the middle of that, and then of course, you know, a lot of the Um, but it's both of those things. Um, and the word faithfulness for us is related to faith. It's full of faith, right? Faithfulness means full of faith. But when we're talking about like being faithful, it means that you are doing things that are faithful to that. If you're unfaithful in a relationship or unfaithful, that means that you've stepped outside of those bounds and you're not being full of faith. And the interesting thing is that the even in the Greek wording of that, it's the same sort of connection. When you go, what's the pistos? Pistos, because like you can talk. It's so like sometimes like pistos and the words that are attached to pistos are like in believing and you believe this and if you have belief in this and pistos, but then it talks about the pistos of Christ and because he is faithful, let us also be faithful, and then it's still talking about pistos. Um so there it's a word in both of our languages that like has a spectrum of meaning that's all attached to the one thing. It's not just a believing as a mental assent, but it's attached to the works that prove that. So when you get to the faith is the substance of things hoped for, the whole description of that isn't just about what people saw, it's about the things they did and the paths that they took. That that's primarily what that chapter is about. So it's a thing that can't be like disconnected. One concept or side of that coin can't be disconnected from the other side of that coin.
But it illuminated their faith.
A what?
It illuminated their faith.
What did their works?
But yeah, they're striving. They have
It
faith.
showed who.
But God still is with them in their walk because they're
Yeah.
confessing their faith.
But
They still don't know what they're going to.
right. But here's
But
the
they're taking
but you
one
just
day
said
at
the
a
word,
time.
the walk, right?
Yeah, the walk.
There's a walk there, and the walk is action. And then when he's saying we walk by faith,
Yeah.
it's not. You're walking. There's a series of actions that you are taking one way or another.
Yeah,
that
you're obeying. You're obeying.
you're obeying. Yeah, there's
obeying.
something that you can't disconnect from faith, as far as like
Yeah.
but you can't disconnect that belief from faithfulness. In the word of what faith is, you got belief as part of it, and then you've got faithfulness, which is the other side of the same coin. But you can't separate those two. Not in the mind of the writer of Hebrews. And yeah.
Faithfulness requires action. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
James would put it in a different way. It's like he talks about like dead, like dead faith or whatever. And he's like, yeah, if you're not doing anything, that's a dead faith. You say you believe, but there's nothing there that's actually suggests any kind of faithfulness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you're not like following up on something or walking, what are you? What's like you can tell. If you just think of like, how am I walking? Is this a walk of faith or not?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yep. But God always requires action with faith.
Yeah.
He doesn't just say, "Oh, well, you believe in me. That's good enough. That's it."
Right. Yeah. Sometimes, and sometimes, like you have like these, you have the thief on the cross.
Yeah.
Didn't really have a chance to do much about it. But like Christ is like, today I'll see you in paradise. So there was a simple believing in faith, but there was also probably like an implied loyalty there too. I think like one thing Michael Heiser does have, as far as like as a definition from faith, which he's brought up in other episodes before, was that faith was seen as the definition, or the Old Testament view of what faith was a believing loyalty. And I've heard a number of scholars say that. And I think the reason for that is because if you are looking at the ancient world, you're like, I am loyal to this God. Over in that city, they're loyal to that God. And, and
Yeah.
there's kind of like an association. Well, that is the God over there, but I live over here, so I better be loyal to this God so that we'll have rain and we'll have like these things. But like if I go over there, maybe I might want to be loyal to those gods or that God over there. So it's kind of like the believing that they existed wasn't really like that much of a problem. It was more like, okay, are you making claims about your God which are true? Because I believe in my God over here. So it wasn't. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic, right? So it's like, who are you faithful to? So remember, like that.
Well, sometimes it's economic, like the one where Paul is talking in Athens,
Mhm.
and they have this statue of the unknown God.
Mhm.
They believed in what's her name, Athena, and they built little statues of her, and that was like their livelihood. And that's what they
Right.
were afraid of, losing their livelihood. They didn't have a way to earn their substance that they needed to survive.
Remember that.
And that's like when you're talking about these other gods in other places, it could be the same thing.
Yeah. There were like definitely like parallel gods.
Yeah.
Thor would be like very related to Zeus or Baal. But like, here's like an example, okay, of what I'm talking about. Like that, remember the leper that goes for healing comes to Elijah, and Elijah, tells him, well, Elijah doesn't even go out to meet him. I think the guy's name is Naaman, and he's from like some other place, and he's heard about this prophet named Elijah, and he's got leprosy. And there's a slave girl that he has around, and she goes, why don't you go over to, you got nothing to, you got nothing to lose, why don't you go over to this guy named Elijah? So he seeks Elijah out, and Elijah doesn't even come out. He tells the servant, go tell him this. And the servant goes out and says, dip yourself in the Jordan 7 times, right? And he's going, okay, I don't think I'm going to do that, because like we've got much better rivers like that in Syria. And then, but his generals say, look, like, you got nothing to lose. Yeah, his pride. It's like, you got nothing to lose. Just do it. So he goes and does it. And lo and behold, he's got like new skin, right? So he wants to give Elijah some gift. Elijah doesn't take the gift, but he goes, okay, you won't accept my gift, but can I ask a favor of you? Can I bring back basketfuls of dirt back? You're thinking, basketfuls of dirt? What's that all about? Because he wants some of that territory of Israel. He's like, whoever this God is that you have over here, I want to bring back some of this dirt, and I'm going to spread it on the ground. He goes, but excuse me for this one thing. If I have to go, I have to be, my king is very old, and he leans on my shoulder. And then when we go into our temple, we're both going to bow to Dagon. But when I bow, I'm going to be bowing to Yahweh. Right? But he's bringing back dirt with him because he wants to worship on that ground. And it's sort of like, because that's the way they're thinking. They're thinking of these territorial sort of gods, right?
Yeah.
And it's not that like he's always acknowledged maybe that like there is a Yahweh, but there's also Dagon. But in my heart, I am now loyal to Yahweh. And that's why even with Ruth, it was sort of like a thing like she's attached to her mother-in-law and she doesn't want to see her mother-in-law. And she goes, no, I'll go back with you. And because of her commitment to Naomi, um, she's saying, I'll your
Your
God will
God.
be your people will be my people, and your God will be my God.
Uh-huh.
And to us, we're kind of like going, it's something, like not that great about that, but it works.
Yeah.
So she becomes loyal to Yahweh. Same thing with like, so you see the way that it's worded in these Old Testament scriptures, and it's kind of like people who see that Yahweh is different from the other gods that they serve. So when you have like a term like faith in a God, it wasn't a matter of like so much of like believing they existed or something like that. It was, where were your loyalties? And loyalty to Yahweh was like was kind of like that's the starting point, for a lot of people. And it was like it wasn't just a raw like, oh, I believe in the existence of God, or I believe in, like it wasn't really like that. It's like, I'm going to be loyal to that God. And So a believing loyalty is a great definition for the Old Testament view on faith.
Okay.
I talked about what's her name, Rahab.
Yeah.
Rahab's heard all about like what Yahweh did, and
Mhm.
did out in the wilderness, and how they kicked butt over there, and what Yahweh did to Pharaoh, and he's like, and she's like, I'm not, I'm going to help these spies out. Even though that means I am saying goodbye to Jericho and my people. And she becomes loyal to Yahweh because she abandons her gods and her people and is saved because of that.
He just
She
Yep.
her loyalty has shifted from what she grew up with to this God Yahweh, who's she's only just heard about.
she just traded up.
She traded up.
Yeah.
For sure.
That's good.
There's only one God. I heard a thing that they tried to I don't remember where I heard it, but we're talking about um God demanding that he be the only God. And they explained it like this, like when you get married, you you have one wife, one husband. That's your only husband. And he was like, this guy
Yeah.
that was got it, and he was talking about the church. The church, there's only one wife,
Oh, for
bride,
us but for us
right?
there's only one God.
One bride, one, yes, one groom, one bride. We're the church, we're the bride, right?
As a body of Christ.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
he
I think it
started,
goes, yeah, right. Paul says that, like, and though there be many lords, many and many gods, yet for us there is one God, Yahweh, and I mean the Lord, and Jesus is his son.
yeah.
And really, yeah, it goes beyond. Were you there when I did a thing on that? Like, there's a you see kind of a progression throughout scripture where it's talking about other gods, but really the Bible puts them in their place and say, these are really what you call these other Elohim, these,
Mhm.
like they're small g gods. They're the fallen angels who have rebelled. You're worshiping them as, but there's somebody who created all of them, and their proper role has always to be his servants.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and so it's kind of like, it doesn't deny the existence of them. It just redefines who they are to
Right.
the pagan to a pagan mindset. It says like No, there's one God. There's so like you see God introducing himself and or saying of himself things like he's the God of gods, right? The Elohim of all other Elohim, or that there is no one like him. There is no Elohim like Yahweh. He's in a different category altogether.
Yeah.
And then these Elohim get redefined as messengers. You know, that at least the good ones are called messengers, or they're fallen messengers. And yeah, they're glorious, and men have been tempted to worship them. Even John in Revelation falls down as if to worship to the angel that's bringing him that, you know, like showing him all these things, and he's like, yeah, make
No.
sure you don't do that. I'm a servant of Christ like you are, you know,
Yeah.
and I hold to the testimony of Jesus like you do.
Mhm.
So so that's kind of like this. So like when Paul's making that statement, he's like, you know, there are other beings out there and there are all these other things, but for us, we have this understanding that there really is only one creator ultimately.
Mhm.
You know, and he's the one we're loyal to anyway. You know, for us, there's only one God.
Mhm.
But yeah, there's been a whole journey in the Bible, in Scripture about that.
Yeah. And it's so easy to when well, before I was saved, I mean, my I knew God, but really my gods were like things like money and time and control and all these other things that were like that I thought about so much more than I ever thought about God. You know what I'm saying? Even
Mhm.
though I knew God, but I wasn't saved yet.
Right.
So uh um it's so easy to find all these quote unquote gods, you know, around you, whether they have a name or not.
Mhm.
You know, you have to stay the course and realize who God is, and everything else is like you have to have perspective, because you can easily get lost
Yeah.
in it by accident, you know, or by not a real fault or not something that you plan.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that must come through prayer, right? And relationship, and right, Mark?
Mhm.
That how
Yeah.
you that's how you
Well,
keep that,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Perspective.
So for us, there's kind of like a caveat. We're thinking, you know, well, there are no other gods that like modern Westerners think about, you know, as far as, you know, they don't worship Zeus or they don't worship Baal or anything like that. Um, and so it's, you know, it's believing loyalty in Yahweh as that's your particular God. Well, so believing loyalty isn't just about like being it's it's being loyal to Yahweh instead of other gods or no God at all. For us, we have to add in or no God at all, you
Hmm.
know, because like there's still like being loyal to no God at all is still disloyalty to God.
Right. Yeah.
And 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 we don't think of, you know, when you're talking about idolatry in the Old Testament, then you're talking about like particular gods people used to worship. But for Paul, he expands that and he calls covetousness, which is idolatry, you know? And so he starts
Yeah.
expanding the idea of idolatry even to areas of our heart where we're wanting something else that's, you know, like we're not content with God, or something like that. Covetousness, you know?
Yeah.
That's like food for thought, you know, like
It
going
is.
covetousness to Paul was idolatry. And you're going, okay, so now we're not talking about like the literal, you know, like silver or wooden idols anymore, but we're making images of something else.
Mhm.
And that's something that we're going to be talking about in Daniel, because there was a giant image that was made in chapter 3, and
Oh, the statue.
and so it's
All
that
the metals and stuff, metals,
yeah, the
wood.
gold statue of golden head and all that,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that one.
yeah. Or actually, I should say the statue that Nebuchadnezzar made that everybody was
Made.
supposed to fall down and worship, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And and then of course later on, he has a dream of another statue that's just being brought down. And like, so there's all these things, about like the idolatry that's associated with that, but also just the corruption of the image of God, which is man. And once that happens, he becomes a beast, and we'll get into all of that, like in the future. But
Good
that's
time.
yeah, I'm looking forward to it, guys, and I think it's about time to hang up because I think I might try to force
Okay.
Chris to watch The Chosen with me.
Yeah.
Goes,
We'll see.
Where
All
are you?
right.
What are you watching? Are you rewatching season 2 or?
I'll watch the whole thing again.
Have you
Oh,
ever seen
right? So good. So
it?
good.
Has to be from the beginning.
All right, you guys. We'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.